Welcome, and thank you for joining me again. I'm Bishop Bill and a member of the Spiritual Growth Core Group at St. Michael's, Newhaven. As part of our 900th anniversary celebrations, I'm seeking to introduce you to the four major prophets of the Old Testament. In this 10th study, we begin our look at the prophet Daniel. What do we already know about this man? When did he live? Where did he live? To whom did he speak? And were his words taken notice of? You're probably familiar with the story of Daniel in the lion's den and maybe other famous cameos from this book describing the life and times of the prophet Daniel. This is going to be an exciting series of study sessions, so let us begin with prayer. Lord, please meet us in your word and through your servants, the prophets. We begin this session with a selection of verses from Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So, Daniel 1:17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So the prophet Daniel. Daniel is God's appointed messenger from amongst the people of Israel, but sent to people other than the people of Israel. Daniel is one of the major prophets of the Old Testament period, whose ministry came at a crucial stage in the history of the kingdom of Judah, who leaves us one of the major Old Testament books. His name means God's judge. Daniel was a man raised up by Yahweh in the courts of imperial power to represent there the view of the living God. So in 3 sessions, we will look at prophet Daniel and his prophecy. In this session, we consider the prophet in his time. In the second of the 3 sessions, we discover Daniel's vision of God and his view of humanity as he sees it from God's perspective. And in the third session, we look at the burden of Daniel's message. So we come to our familiar map. During the last half of the 7th century BC, a huge 3-cornered contest for the world supremacy was being fought in the Middle East. The contenders were Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. For some 300 years, Assyria, with its capital Nineveh in the North Euphrates Valley, had ruled a vast empire. It was now, however, growing weaker. At the same time, Babylon in the South Euphrates Valley was growing stronger. Egypt, the third contestant in the Nile Valley, had 1,000 years before been a world power, had then declined, but was once again becoming ambitious. During this period, the southern kingdom of Judah survived as a tributary of the Assyrian Empire. It was a testing time, but the faithfulness to Yahweh of kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah meant that the kingdom continued despite the pressures put upon it by its powerful overlord. The memory lived in the kingdom of Judah of the miraculous deliverance under King Hezekiah when Yahweh intervened and saved Jerusalem itself from destruction by the encamping Assyrian army. Something that we met, if you remember, when we were looking at the prophet Isaiah. 627 BC proved to be a significant year. The great but declining Assyrian Empire was weakened considerably by a Scythian invasion, and its last great king, Ashurbanipal, died. The Babylonians took advantage of Assyria's weakness and finally and swiftly broke the back of the empire. In 612 BC, Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, was destroyed by the Babylonians, a reality predicted by Nahum, prophet Nahum, one of our minor prophets of the Old Testament. In 609 BC, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Assyrian army, leaving Babylon in the ascendancy. 3 years later, in 606 BC, at the famous Battle of Carchemish, the Babylonians crushed Egyptian aspirations to imperial power in the lands of the Fertile Crescent. And for the next 70 years, the 70 years of Jewish captivity, the Babylonians ruled the world. The kingdom of Judah was one of those tributary states that had backed the wrong superpower. She had looked to Egypt for help against the Assyrians and then against the Babylonians. After the defeat of the Egyptians by the Babylonians at Carchemish in 606 BC and at Hamath in 605 BC, Judah was left exposed to the ravages of the angered Babylonians. The Babylonians took control of the Palestine area after crushing the Egyptians and punished those states, including Judah, which had looked to Egypt for help. And Daniel was caught up in that punishment. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, so this is 607, 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Daniel was taken from Jerusalem to Babylon as a kind of hostage at this time. Jehoiakim was left in Jerusalem as vassal king for Nebuchadnezzar. We come to this familiar chart with the long perspective from 950 to 400, the major powers of the day. At the moment we're here with Babylon, and then the northern southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. There's Israel, the captivity and the fall of Samaria in 722, and Judah, the fall of Jerusalem and captivity 586. These are, in this part of the diagram, are what fits into this period here. So we have the kings of southern kingdom of Judah at the end of its life, and we have the various prophets who are speaking God's word at that time. Here are the three different deportations, as it were, from Jerusalem to Babylon. And as we have seen, during the first years of the 6th century, in another conflict between Babylon and Egypt, King Joachim revolted against his Babylonian overlord in order to give support to his Egyptian benefactor. By the time the Babylonians got to Jerusalem to deal with the insurrection, Jehoiakim had died. His 18-year-old son, Jehoiakim, bore the brunt of the Babylonians' fury, and in 597 BC, after a 2-month siege, surrendered Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar. Jehoiakim himself and other nobles were deported to Babylon. In Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's uncle, was set up by the Babylonians as a puppet king in Jerusalem. In 588 BC, under pressure from the pro-Egypt party in Judah, Zedekiah broke faith with Babylon, and the Babylonians had had enough. So after an 18-month siege, Jerusalem was broken into, plundered and destroyed, and the surviving populace was deported to Babylon in 586 BC. So the southern kingdom of Judah saw its demise in a series of defeats by the Babylonians. In 607 BC, in Jehoiakim's reign, treasures and some royalty were deported, and that included Daniel. In Jehoiakim's reign, in 597 or 598 BC, I just want to say sometimes the years are out by 1 year in different commentaries and so on. It may be because the date is counted from when a siege began or when it ended, or it may be that there are slightly different ways of calculating exact dates. But forgive the slight anomalies every now and then. More treasures, 10,000 officers, and Ezekiel were deported at this time. And then in 586, during King Zedekiah's reign, Jerusalem herself was destroyed. The people were taken into Babylonian captivity. This time, considering Prophet Daniel, we need to catch a glimpse of what happened at superpower level during the 6th century BC and beyond. A series of weak emperors caused Babylon to lose its power. As the Babylonians declined, the Medo-Persian bloc expanded its influence. The Median king Astyages was outmaneuvered by the Persian king Cyrus in about 550 BC, and his realm absorbed into Persia. In 539 BC, the Persians, under King Cyrus, who's actually named in Isaiah's prophecy, if you remember, in chapter 45, incredible chapter, the Persians under King Cyrus struck out against Babylonia, and they captured the city of Babylon overnight and went on to capture the whole of the empire. They then defeated Egypt around 525, and the authority of the Persian Empire spread as far as the Greek islands and Macedonia. The Persian was a benevolent king, a relatively benevolent emperor. And from the first year of his reign, he allowed some exiled Jews in Babylon to return to their land and rebuild the temple at Jerusalem. And the temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt in 516 BC, 70 years after its destruction in 586 BC. In 332 BC, the Persian Empire would be overthrown by Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who went on to build an empire of incredible stretch. As you can see, this is by the year 323 BC. In 146 BC, the Roman Empire would rise to replace Greece as a world power. And by 116 AD, it was at its greatest extent, the Roman Empire, that replaced the Greek Empire. So I hope that gives you a little picture of what was going on in these centuries around the time of Daniel and beyond on the international scene, as it were. There's another way of looking at the prophets, to understand where the prophets come. Here we have what are called pre-exilic prophets, prophets who preached before the fall of Jerusalem. Here are the exilic prophets, prophets who were preaching at the time of the exile, those 70 years. And here are the post-exilic prophets, prophets who came after the people returned to Jerusalem from exile in Babylon. Here are prophecies at different periods that are to their intended audience is Gentile nations. For example, here's Nahum, who was the prophet who predicted the fall of Nineveh. Some of the prophets spoke to the northern kingdom of Judah before its demise, and some spoke to the kingdom of Judah before its demise. And then here we discover Daniel. Here's Isaiah back here in the 8th century. Here's Jeremiah, whose ministry ended just about around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Here's Ezekiel, who continued after the fall of Jerusalem. And here's Daniel, who continued beyond the return of the Jews to their homeland. Daniel is a prophet during the last years of the kingdom of Judah and during its exile in Babylon. But his prophetic word is not directed towards the people of Judah. So really, Daniel should be put up here, I think, in this line. But anyway, whilst a youth, he was carried off with other members of the extended royal family and lived in Babylon during the whole period of the captivity. He came to occupy high office in the Babylonian and Persian empires. He became a friend and confidant to King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel lived under 7 Babylonian rulers through the fall of Babylon into the first years of the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel's prophetic word was geared towards the palace, towards the kings, towards the rulers of his world. And the makeup of the book of Daniel actually reflects this orientation, not towards the people of Judah, but towards the nations or the people of power in the nations that ruled the Fertile Crescent area. So the book of Daniel actually comes in its original form in two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. And it begins in Hebrew and it ends in Hebrew, but the majority of it, or the kernel if you like, is in Aramaic. So there's an introduction as Daniel is described becoming part of the court in Babylon. And there is the writings at the end of the book which describe Daniel's life when he was over 70 years old. But the bulk of the book is written in Aramaic. Why? Because the intended audience is more than the people of God. People of God may be interested in this and this, but this is written towards a different audience. These chapters carry a theology of history written in the international language of the day. The audience, especially for these chapters, is the world out there, the leaders of that world, the people who think that they govern the destinies of humankind. So we just want to show you these chapters for a moment. So I'm talking a little bit about the structure of the book of Daniel. It's fairly simple, and this is the structure of those books in the center, the kernel books, chapters, sorry. And if you can imagine a series of envelopes, that's what these 6 chapters look like. Chapters 2 and 7 are about the same subject. Chapters 3 and 6 are about the same subject. And the heart of it, chapters 4 and 5, are about the same subject. So chapters 2 and 7 introduce the 4 kingdoms of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, plus the idea of an eternal kingdom. Chapters 3 and 6 each illustrate God's power to deliver his servants. We have the burning fiery furnace and Daniel in the lion's den. In other words, the kingdom of heaven responding to the pride of earthly kingdoms. And then in chapters 4 and 5, the kernel of the kernel, these chapters declare God's judgment on proud human rulers. And the initiative in these chapters lies with the eternal kingdom. The testimony in them is extracted by the Lord from the great king Nebuchadnezzar that the Most High God alone is Lord of the earth. And 50 or 60 years later, dealt with in these 2 chapters, Belshazzar is reminded of the same fact. The Lord of heaven is the judge of humankind, and Belshazzar, the banquet giver, is found wanting in that eternal court. What about content? Well, the book is about imperial history, and more than imperial history. The same themes recur in the dreams of the emperor and the visions of Daniel. Momentous dramatic events are referenced in this prophetic book, and proud, strong monarchs are warned and brought to testify that the God of Daniel is truly God. So, for example, in chapter 2, verse 47, the king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." In chapter 3, verse 29, the king says, "Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." And in chapter 4, verse 34, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation." And in its main character, Daniel, himself of royal blood, speaks to royalty about one who is truly king of the nations. Instead of being a man about court in Jerusalem, advising the king there, Daniel is taken through his personal captivity to become God's spokesman in the highest court in the Fertile Crescent. The truth that he declares there is that God is governor, not just of nations like Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, but also of individuals like Daniel. Daniel's being taken hostage did not spell the end of his political career. It brought about the start of a political career which is rather like Joseph's. Daniel, God's judge, becomes the announcer on behalf of the living God of the way in which God, the judge, looks on and rewards the deeds of powerful men. So here, at the end of this study session, we pause for discussion. I've got a couple of questions. What is significant about the way the fall of Jerusalem is described in Daniel's prophecy? Here are the words. "And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his," that's Nebuchadnezzar's, "hand." And secondly, how then do you think the rest of the prophecy might be seen to be a reflection on this same significance? You might like to have think over the next few days about this slant, if you like, this way of looking at politics, at human diplomacy and power, and the way in which in Daniel's book, the kernel of it written in the international language of the day is trying to get something across to the people who lived and worked and ruled at that sort of international level. It's an amazing book. Father, thank you for the little glimpse we've had in this session of your calling upon Daniel, a captive who you brought with his friends to the center of the court of the world power of his day. In fact, for him, of two world powers. And we ask that you would open our eyes as we read this special book to see you as Daniel learned to see you, to see humanity as he came to see humanity, and to hear the burden of the message that he received from you, that you wanted to get across to him, and through him to us. So guide us and lead us, we pray, in Jesus' name. So thank you for coming with me on this little journey, and next time we shall have a look at Daniel's vision of who God is, and arising out of that, his view of what humanity is like. So in preparation for next session, it would be wonderful if you could read Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 to 47. Hope to see you then. Thank you. Bye.